Picture yourself set up for good and the whole of a life in the mystery zone. Make us a house, some faraway town where nobody will know us well, where your dad's not around. And all the trouble you look for all your life, you will find it for sure in the mystery zone.
The desperate encounter between human inquiry and the silence of the universe. That for Camus is the absurd. And it's this, again, rational, logical call that we put out to the world to say, what is this all for? Where is the explanation? How do I fit in? And the world's silence in the face of that question. A question I think that, we are asking today, right? We can ask, why is this happening? Why is this happening all around the world, and why is this happening to us? For what reason? For what purpose? And what is my role in relation to what is going on in the world right now? What is the significance that it has for me, for my life, for the people I love, the people I know, the communities I belong to? What's it all mean? Right? We can ask those questions, but we know that the world itself is not offering up an answer. And as much as we come to realize that our life as we knew it and experienced it is somewhat removed with trying to kind of, take measures, trying to adjust ourselves, to carry forth in ways that we were, to reinvent ourselves in ways that might stick after this. But all of it brings us to this feeling of being estranged from what is familiar, being estranged from what we've known, how we've acted, how we behaved, how we've maintained and sustained various relationships, projects in our lives. And in turn, now we feel a little bit ourselves like a stranger to the life we're living now, right? To the moments we find ourselves in, somewhat living on the outside of our own lives. And it's no coincidence that Camus' first works were called The Stranger, or translated as The Stranger, sometimes translated as The Outsider. So, what Camus does for us in the myth of Sisyphus, he really helps define this absurdity to our condition, something that is there all along, but in moments in our lives we really begin to become aware of it. Again, this rational human call for understanding combined with the silence of the world. And so he enumerates for us several experiences that we can all more or less identify with at certain times in our lives where we really feel this absurdity to one degree or another. So we're going to go through those experiences, what he sometimes calls the signs of the absurdity. And maybe we're not always conscious or aware that that's what this is, but as we begin to look at it, maybe you recognize these times in your own life, these absurd conditions being felt in your own days. So there's a moment sometimes we have where we're going about our day, and we're involved in something, and we are just kind of spacing out, that our thoughts aren't anywhere in particular. And it might be a short stretch, it might be a long stretch. and someone comes along, maybe a friend of ours, and says, "Hey, what are you thinking, right? Um, what's going on in there?" And you don't even know, right? There's actually a void. You say, "Well, I don't know what I was thinking." I, you have no kind of recollection. You've just completely spaced out. Your mind is half there, not quite there. This moment, Camus identifies as an interesting moment which shows to us, demonstrates to us, this peculiar state, this odd state, he says, of the soul, in which the void, the nothingness of things, of our own consciousness, and how that our thoughts can just empty out, how that can itself become eloquent, how that itself can be articulated for us in these moments. So this is one instance, maybe to a small extent, not so consequential, but a moment where the cracks in our everyday lives, in our everyday activities, is felt a bit more when we say, yeah, I don't really know what I was thinking. And then you just kind of carry on with your conversation or your day. So another instance in which we feel the absurdity of our existence, Camus points to, is something that, again, we could probably identify with right now. He talks about how you get used to these routines in your life, right? The waking up, the eating breakfast perhaps, the running out to class or running out to work, the regular schedules that you keep, the regular paths that you cross, the people you see, the buildings you enter, the buildings you exit, all of those kinds of patterns that you fall into day after day after day, week after week after week. And eventually something happens, right? Something happens that kind of jolts you out of that pattern. And you see that your life is kind of going along in this way, but you've now been pushed out of that pattern, out of that routine, and you kind of look at how things were going, and you ask yourself, is that really what I am? Or is that really who I was, doing those things, going through those motions, without even really being that conscious of it? So when we have something that comes up in our life, whether it be something we're experiencing now, or whether it be something individually that happens to you, maybe it's a physical injury that you go through and it just makes you have to change the way you approach the day. You have a crutch, you're on crutches now, or you're using a scooter to get by because you can't, or whatever it may be, that you now have to rethink those routines. Well, then you start to critically look at those routines and evaluate those routines and remove yourself from having to live those routines and start to think, well, is that who I was, what I am, what is that relationship to me now? So you feel a little bit estranged from those habits of living that you once fell into. Camus says the habits of living precede the habit of thinking about life, right? So we get into these routines often without even consciously reflecting on what it is we're getting ourselves into. We just fall into them. And then we go along and we go along and we go along, and then finally something kind of puts us out in such a way that we have to start thinking about why we were doing those things in the first place. So that comes on page 13 of the Myth of Sisyphus. So we have these two here, right? The absent mind, being there and not being there, consciously, breaking these routines that define your life. When you break those routines, you create that distance between you and what you have been and what you have done, which can begin to open up that space where you question how you belong, who you are. He says another sign of the absurdity of our existence is how we experience time. Time carries us through this life, right? Here we are, once young, right? And years go by, and here we are, still quite young, but a good bit older and experienced more. And here we are, before we know it, decades have gone by, and we've accumulated a number of experiences, created a lot of relationships, maybe accomplished a lot of things, and we feel this on our own bodies. We see it in the mirror. Maybe, one day you recognize some wrinkles that weren't there before, or some grays that weren't there before. You hold up your hands to yourself and you see that they look coarse and aged as well. Well, he says we belong to time. It just kind of carries us forward. We live our whole lives in its arms, if you will, and there's nothing we can do about that. He says often when we're young, we're so much bent on looking toward the future, right, and what the future is going to bring us. And then we get to a point in our lives where we're not really sure when this happened, but we've been looking more at the past and what we've done and what we've been and what we wish we would have done and what we wish we would have tried. Or we look at those memories, right? So there's a point in our lives where the looking forward turns into the looking back, more so and more so. He says time carries us, and our bodies age, and these moments that we have, they become memories. And so this question here about your relationship to time and your relationship to what you were, what you are now, and what you will be can create this feeling of uncertainty and an unknown sense of how the process of aging ties in to understanding your place in that order of things. There's a great poem here, Salvatore Quasimodo. I'll just leave it up here for you to read. I think that poem captures a bit of what Camus is saying there about the nature of time. So one other thing he says, and I'll pull, he gives us more, and this is not the last, but another thing he says here is, I'll give you a quote from the text, Myth of Sisyphus, page 14. He says, "We perceive that the world," and here he's talking about the natural world in particular, "is dense, sensing to what a degree a stone is foreign and irreducible to us, with what intensity nature or a landscape can negate us." Right here we are in the midst of this vast desert in the natural world, and we're immediately aware of our own vulnerability within this powerful landscape. That we don't have shelter nearby, we don't have water nearby, we don't have food nearby. We are exposed to the elements in the raw, right? That nature can negate us in this way. It can dominate us in this way. He says that at the heart of all beauty lies something inhuman. And these hills, the softness of the sky, lose the illusory meaning with which we had clothed them, right? These names, these categories, these terms that we use to carve up nature and try to control it and try to make it more familiar, make it our own, make it more human. There are times in our lives where all of those artificial concepts and categories and terms really start to fall away and nature confronts us in its rawness. He says the primitive hostility of the world rises up to face us across millennia. Right? These hills will be here for a very long time after we leave, and they were here for a very long time before we showed up. What do they care for the way we explain those hills or name those hills? They are what they are, and they are indifferent to us. The world evades us because it becomes simply itself again, independently of us. This is on page 14 of the Myth of Sisyphus. So the way we might describe here what's going on is the world shedding that artifice that we've imposed on it, right? The names and language we've tried to use to capture the natural world and stick to it. So the inhumanity of the natural world can certainly make us question our place here and how we belong. There she is, this woman that you've maybe known for a long time. Maybe you've dated her. Maybe she's a good friend of yours. Maybe you grew up together. And there she is. And Camus will point out that there are moments where the people who are closest to us, who we feel we know, maybe sometimes even better than ourselves, will start to feel strange to us. Will start to present themselves as a question mark in our own lives. Because we can never truly know what these people are thinking. No matter how close you are to someone, whether it's your neighbor, your best friend, your wife, your husband, your girlfriend, your boyfriend, whoever it is, you can never get inside that person's head. You can never know their thoughts, feel what they're feeling. And so you are cut off in some way. And sometimes this gap between you and that other person is pronounced, where Camus says that person who was familiar to you, we now see as a stranger. The one we had loved months ago or years ago. And you can think about maybe some earlier friendships you've had or earlier relationships you've had and how you've grown apart. And maybe you don't even talk to each other now, and that person is off doing their thing with their relationships, with their new friends, with their new lovers, with their new spouses. And they're in this strange other world, a world without you. So someone who you maybe woke up to, someone who maybe you spoke to all the time, someone whose thoughts you could complete, sentences you can complete, now feels so strange and distant to you. That feeling is a feeling of the absurd. And it doesn't, have to be someone who you even know. It might be a stranger on the street, he says. We get this feeling sometimes with just watching people. If you are like me, you're a people watcher. And maybe, you like to go to the park, sit in a cafe. Maybe you liked to go to the quad and just hang and observe people and watch people get involved in their own things, right? And that itself can sometimes seem quite strange, especially, let's say you see someone on their phone, right, and they're talking on their phone, and maybe they're having an argument, and, they're somewhat, a few feet away from you. They don't know you, you don't know them, but they're really getting heated about this exchange. And it can seem pretty peculiar, pretty funny, really, to watch them get so worked up about something that you have nothing to do with, right? It's a show for you. And so people can appear in this way to you. You wonder, well, what is it all about for them? Why are they so worked up about something? The strangeness of others is another thing that he points to, which creates this feeling of the absurdity. Now this here is a photograph, though, of an author we've read, Jorge Luis Borges. And here he is again. And we might recall that reading, Borges and I, because what that reading does is point to another thing that Camus is articulating here, and that is the strangeness of ourselves. How we can appear estranged from who we are. That person in the mirror, you catch your own reflection in a window maybe, and you say, oh, is that me? Is that me? You almost are beside yourself, outside yourself, looking at yourself and wondering what it is you are, who you are. Maybe you've heard yourself on, audio or video, and you said, is that what I sound like? Is that what I look like? And it seems quite strange to you. So he writes, likewise, the stranger who at certain seconds comes to meet us in a mirror, the familiar and yet alarming brother we encounter in our own photographs, also the absurd, is also the absurd. You see the little typo there between photographs and is. So that elusiveness of our own selves, we try to seize who we are, he says, and we feel sure sometimes, but then when we try to define it and summarize it, it just slips through like water, slips through our own fingers. We can be a stranger to ourselves often. So you have here the 6 signs of absurdity, the 6 experiences we may have of the absurdity of our own existence. And this is not an exhaustive list, but these are, he thinks, moments that everyone can relate to at some point in their life. And the final one that he gives is this realization of your own mortality, your own death, that really this is the only reality. And as we've seen with Schopenhauer, we do a lot to kind of distract ourselves from thinking about this, to avoid thinking about it. But sometimes it hits us pretty hard, especially when we experience the death of a close one, and it makes us turn back and think about our own limited time here. And so that moment, that realization, can strike us as absurd, where we wonder, well, why are we here? What are we here for? And we don't get an answer back from the universe. So our next video will begin to really take up how how Camus makes use of this myth, the myth of Sisyphus here. This is a figure who he's very much interested in because he thinks this figure resembles us in important ways, or I should say we resemble this figure, this Greek mythological figure, in important ways. And there are things we can learn from this myth about how to live our own lives and how to imagine ourselves happy. So we'll pick up there with the next video.
Watch your mouth, we've only opened up Pandora's box. You're past my head, uncertain.